We have Pete Rankin, who will be giving a talk on binary patching, making the switch, and who is also the person who wrote the firmware for this year's badge. So the person that wrote that Snake and Tetris game is standing up on stage right now. So let's welcome Pete to the stage.
Wow. Thank you. Welcome. I know it's 4 o'clock, but let's just get started. Christmas 2017, I saw an ad for the Nintendo Switch, and I couldn't help but think, I would buy that if only it was a phone. And we do. We ask this about a lot of different products. I would get that if it could do blah. But I don't think this is the right way to look at that problem. Should the Switch be a phone, or should my phone be a Switch? We should not have to buy new devices in order to get access to new features. And we should not have to beg companies to add features to our stuff. They should already be there. And we shouldn't have to borrow from a range of devices when we need to go on a plane, like an e-reader or an MP3 player. And when we do make our stuff work the way that we want it to, we should not feel like we're stealing anything. I think we should be builders, we should be hackers, and we should be making devices do the things that they were never, ever meant to do. Today's talk, my talk today is on binary patching, and I think that this is one of the very many tools that you can use to make your devices do the things that they were never meant to do. And so I'll get stuck into it and not leave you. I know it's 4 o'clock. My name is Peter, and at the moment, I am working for a company called Pen10 that does a lot of great hardware stuff. And I think a lot of my skills and my ideas have come from them, and feel free to ask me questions afterwards. But I'm a software developer and researcher, so I like to think that I can write as much code as what I can reverse engineer or understand. But more importantly, and I think this is the big part, I'm big on retro Nintendo and gaming and emulators. And I have very fond memories of long trips to places with my Game Boys. And I hope that the nostalgia that maybe you feel with those Nokia phones brings back some of those memories of throwing your 3310 to the ground and being able to pick it up without a broken screen. And yes, many hours went into the firmware of the badge, but also the Echo, who did the actual badge design, went through many prototypes. And so kudos to him, who actually came up with the Nokia theme. It gave me the groundwork to actually build the firmware. And also, I'd like to say thank you to my partner, Sarah, who I love very much, who supported me for the months that I spent on this, for which I was not very pleasant all the time. So it's about a 50-minute talk, and I'm going to spend a few minutes going over the concept, and then a bit of an introduction into binary patching, where I talk about how I patched Android Bluetooth to fix an issue. And then the talk kind of splits and goes off in a different direction, because at that point, I had learnt about Linux kernels and how to build them, and I was looking for the next problem, which is where I'll go into trust zone interception. So I hope there's something for everyone in this talk today. So the concept. I saw that ad for the Nintendo Switch, and it looked great. A console and a portable combined, and with sweet, sweet controllers. They really are. They've actually got little connectors at the bottom of them. They work at 1.8 volts. The screen is a good size, good storage, good processing power. A great system. But like many of you, I have a phone. Why would I carry two devices? And it has more power and more storage than the Switch. If only it had buttons. And this is a real problem. So many devices are losing their buttons. And I don't think it'll be that long before devices have no buttons and no inputs altogether. And it's really sad, because buttons are a great way to interact with products. So I hacked. I had this idea. Get just the controllers for the Switch. Get my phone, 3D design and print a case that supported it. 3D CAD is very accessible, and I didn't even need a 3D printer. I could just send my design away, and someone mailed me a piece of plastic that didn't fit the first time. But to no less, 3D printing is definitely accessible. And the controllers, they paired by Bluetooth, but it lagged. It lagged to the point where it was unusable. You'd press a button, it would happen after about 5 seconds, and then everything would happen. So I looked around on forum after forum. I tried to understand Bluetooth, and it's complicated, and it's hard, and I don't understand all of it. But if you just keep pursuing, you can figure it out, or you can find someone else who can help you, or in this case, someone else who had already figured it out. Open your Bluetooth default shared objects. Find this byte pattern, or replace it with this one. Or find this byte pattern and replace it with this one. And that's kind of where it gets started. I have a binary patch that I want to apply so I can make my phone do the things it was never meant to do. And you don't even need a rooted or broken device to begin with. If you have an Android device, you can pull any binary off that phone that you want without rooting it. You can use ADB, and there is lots of Google tutorials about how to do that. You don't need root, you don't need bootloader unlocked. And once you've got those files, you can open them up in a hex editor, which is just basically Word for binaries. And you do a find and replace. Unless you can't find, which is really devastating, because then you're like, well, what do I do now? But there's a better question to ask yourself. What exactly is the patch doing? Because we're talking about a network process, something that does radio stuff. Is it making authentication completely disabled? Is it setting up a custom listening Bluetooth socket? Who knows? So before you binary patch things, try and understand it yourself first. And so I went back to that forum where I found that patch. And someone pointed me to this idea that it was this SSR max latency value for Bluetooth. And I can tell you now, to this day, I still don't fully comprehend what that feature does. But Android source code is readily available. And from that, I was able to find the define that said it's the value 800, which is hex 320. And if you look at this little bit of disassembly, which you can get disassembled now on websites, you don't even need a disassembler on your laptop. And it will tell you that they're changing this 320 value to 18. They are basically disabling the SSR max latency value. So now that we know what it does, we now need to find out where it is in our binary. And for that, you do need a disassembler. But lucky for you, as of, I think, a week or two ago, Ghidra, the NSA tool, is available. So feel free to let the NSA help you on your endeavors. And so when you open up a binary like this in a disassembler, there is lots and lots of things to look at, and it's very overwhelming. The important thing to remember is that you would like to find something. So you're looking for something that's unique, something that's constant. And in my case, that hex 320 value is the thing that I imagine would be unique. But there was still like 15, 20 occurrences of it. So you kind of have to iterate through it and apply a bit of understanding. And then I found this spot that looked like it might be right. And that gave me the byte pattern at the bottom, which was the find pattern for my binary. And again, using online tools, you can take that pattern, disassemble it online, change the value, reassemble it, and there you are. You have created and ported your own binary patch. It is that easy to make your devices do the things that they were never meant to do. But this is kind of where some of the easy stuff starts to stop, because unlike some of the early Android phones, it is not as simple as pushing that binary back onto the phone. And to kind of describe why that's the case, I need to explain something about chain of trust. So when you turn your phone on and you give it power, there is a tiny bit of code that is baked into the chipset on your phone. And it has the sole job and responsibility of verifying the signature of the next part. And I apologize, some of these details are a little bit whiffy-woffy for those who do this all the time, but the gist is that it verifies the next stage before executing it, which then loads a primary bootloader on your Android devices. And it's got a bit more space because it's not in the actual wires on your chip. But again, it just really verifies and loads the secondary bootloader. And this is where your phone kind of splits into two phones if you have an Android device. You've got your Android with its Linux kernel, and then you've got the secure world, which handles all your DRM, your keys, your device encryption, your fingerprint scanner, maybe even your facial recognition. And it is this part of the boot chain that starts that and Android. But for now, let's focus on the Android part. This is the Android bootloader that gets loaded next. If you've ever flashed a custom recovery, or redid your phone, or installed Lineage or CygenMod, you've used this tool to flash stuff onto your phone. It's what Fastboot talks to. But it itself is not a Linux kernel, so it loads the Linux kernel from the boot partition. This is what actually does the DM Verity check on your Android system. It checks that Android has not been modified. And if all that is good, we finally, after all that, have got to the point where Android starts up, your processors start, and that's where our Bluetooth object that we want to patch exists. And the important moral of this story is that it is verified. If you change a bit in this boot chain, your phone is a brick, to varying degrees, depending on how high up the chain you change that bit. I've gotten close to this very, very many times. So how do people then install custom ROMs on their Android device? Well, they bootloader unlock. And the thing to remember about bootloader unlocking is all you're doing is you're telling a boot to check nothing in the boot partition. Not the Linux kernel, not the RAM disk, nothing. Boot will just get blindly loaded regardless of its state. But at this point in time, boot still has the code in it to check and verify the Android system, so we still can't patch. But that's when you can actually root your device. And once you root your device, this is what your phone security looks like. Someone who gets access to your phone can change your system partition and your boot partition and get access to anything on your device. So just think about that next time you want to bootloader unlock. Now, changing the system partition means that we're no longer eligible for updates. But the rooting community came up with a solution to this a while ago, and they called it systemless rooting. And what it means is that they don't make any changes to the Android system partition. They do it in the boot partition. They make changes to the Linux kernel such that the Android system remains unchanged and still able to receive updates. So let's do that. We start off with our own Linux driver that we can build for our Android. And it gets to sit in the Linux kernel. And from there, it can see all the processes running in Android. We can search those processes to find the Bluetooth one. Then we can search that Bluetooth process to find our shared object as it exists in memory. And it's the same as what it is on disk, for the most part. And we can search that to find our byte pattern and patch it in memory from the kernel. And that's pretty much it. That is what systemless means when they talk about systemless root or systemless patching. So some useful tricks. I know there's a bit of text on this slide. The get user pages function is super cool. From the Linux kernel, you can ask for any page of any user mode process to be mapped into the kernel and with write permissions so that you can patch and change any byte in any user mode process without changing any permission on any of their pages. It's super cool. And then the other thing is that you might want to read this other file system called proc maps to find out where things are loaded in memory. But if you're in the kernel, you've got access to the structures and the data that's used to store that information, and you can get at it directly. So if you've managed to get as far as building a Linux kernel, and your Linux kernel should be made available, it is GPL. I built my phone's Linux kernel on the Windows subsystem Linux, so it is totally doable. You can get the source code for your phones and build it. And once you've built it, you get this image gz.dtb file. And it might vary depending on what Android or what device you're doing this for. But to flash it, you actually need to put it into a boot image. But there's a wonderful tool called Android Image Kitchen that you can use to pull apart a boot image into the individual parts. And the only one that we care about is the Linux kernel device tree, or Linux kernel and device tree. And we can replace that file once extracted with our built one, and then repack that boot image and flash it onto our phone using Fastboot. And it is that easy to unpack and pack a boot image for your phone. And this is the cool thing. You can do these kind of cool things. So I actually took it a step further after writing that driver and wrote my own Linux kernel input driver for the JoyCons. And I'd never done this before, but there are lots of examples. And I used the Wii controller example from the Linux kernel to build mine. And there are so many good emulators. And now I'm pretty close to having my own phone as a Switch, which I think is pretty cool. And if you're looking at doing this sort of stuff, all my code is available. So I've got my driver at the top, which does the kernel to user mode patching, the input driver, and then someone else came along this and actually built a better one. So you can use their driver, which I would recommend over my code. But now I'm kind of at this point where I can build Linux kernels for my phone, and I can build drivers for my phone. What should my next project be? Well, it's kind of like I'm standing this high, wondering if I could go there. And so I turned my attention to TrustZone, the operating system on your phone that is running that you don't even know is there. So to give you a bit of background, your phone is basically broken into two worlds. The normal world that has your Linux kernel and your Android operating system, and the TrustZone kernel that handles your DRM, your keys, all those security-related features, your fingerprint scanner. So what if we wrote another driver, and we loaded into the Linux kernel again? But we're below secure world. We can't see it. We can't interact with it. But these processes, so your YouTube has to talk to the trustlet that is actually responsible for doing DRM decoding of video. Your fingerprint scanner has to talk to the trustlet that's actually reading and verifying your fingerprint. How does this communication happen? And if you had this problem with computers, and you had two computers and a wire running between them, you'd want to see the messages right in the middle as they're going across. You'd want to sniff the traffic. And the driver for Qualcomm devices is called QCCOM, and it does this problem. It basically allows messages to be transferred from processors to trustlets and back and forth to facilitate this. But if we're in the Linux kernel, we're on the same playing field, and we can make binary patches to that to see what's happening. And Linux source code, it's a big place, but you can totally find things. With very little experience myself, a quick find, I found the source file. And better yet, the first function in that source file was the function I wanted to hook to intercept messages. So it is not that hard to find things in the Linux kernel. And there's plenty of resources around you that can help you out if you're looking to solve these kind of problems. But I probably shouldn't have said it was that simple, because this is where, things get a little bit harder. So I want to hook a function in a kernel. What are my options? you can make source code changes. So you can change the source code for their driver and rebuild it because it's the Linux kernel. So if this is the function you want to intercept, you write your own function nearby, and you just make it call your function with the same args. And you've basically done a hook in source code. The only problem with this method is that what if you don't get the source code to your kernel? What if it's not released for until 2-3 years after? What happens if they don't release it at all? Samsung has been notorious for this in the past. What happens if bootloader unlocking and loading up your own kernel changes the behavior of these things that you want to observe? So sometimes source code changes are not always the best option. We can look for function pointers that point to our function and change them. So again, we have the function we want to intercept, and we have a table of function pointers that will call it. We can write a function that takes exactly the same args and redirect it to it. Only problem is that in my case, this doesn't exist. So this is no good to me either. The next one is to do inline hooks, where you actually change the code at the beginning of a function. So again, we can write our own, and we can put a little jump. So as soon as that function gets execution, we send it somewhere else. But we're putting code over existing code. And at the start of the function is where some interesting things happen, like how the stack gets set up, how registers and variables get set up. So we have to redo those things before we go to our function, and we tend to write small code stubs to fix the stack, to fix the registers, and then ultimately call our function. So it's kind of like the assembly binary form of source code hooking. But this ends up being very function and kernel and version specific, because every time a compiler is run, maybe it outputs slightly different code. Maybe making a one-line change can cause it to think of all sorts of optimizations. So this becomes very specific, and that's not very useful all the time. So let's think about what calls this function. Something else obviously has to use it for a purpose. So what if we wrote our own and redirected that call to ours? And as it turns out, this is exactly the case. There is only one other function call in the QCCOM driver that calls the function that I want to hook. So let's hook that instead. The only problem with this, though, is that these functions are private. The driver, the QCCOM driver, does not make them exposed. You can't look them up with k-all-sims. You can't do a this function name to function pointer lookup. It doesn't work. But again, something has to call it. Something public has to call it. And as it turns out, the first thing that this other thing does, QCCOM unregister listen does, is it calls the one that we want. And functions are just bytes. So we can disassemble them on the fly and find the instructions that are for our call. And then we can work backwards to figure out where that address is. And so now we can mine private functions from public ones. And so now you can find all the other APIs dynamically in the Linux kernel that weren't there before. And you're going to get a lot of crashes. I'm surprised my phone actually still works after this point. Because changing bytes, there is so much more to it. But to show you the problems that I encountered, my kernel for my phone is compiled to be read-only. There's a flag at compile time called config debug read-only data. And with that enabled, the kernel code is read-only. And that's where the driver that I want to patch is. So we can't change it. So what if I recompiled my kernel without this flag? Well, the problem with that is that then everything can patch my kernel. So malware that gets onto your phone can actually rootkit your device. And we don't want that. But this is kind of roughly what it looks like after this is done, so that there is literally only read-write. There is no read-write-x for any part of the kernel. But I thought about like what replies these protections, and it turns out mark read-only data RO is what gets called to apply these protections. And inside of it are two functions, createMappingLate. And their job is to take the kernel and change it from readwritex to readonlyx. But these are private functions inside a public function. And so we can actually mine those addresses. So we take the mark read-only data, disassembly, and we find what we think is our createMappingLate, and we do the same technique, and we get the address, and we call it, and we get a crash. But it turns out that compilers are very smart, and they like to optimize code as much as possible. And so instead of this call being createMappingLate, it ended up being the function 4 layers deeper in the code. And it literally just inlined them. And this bothered me for weeks. And I got to the point where I was struggling, and I called on the help of a friend of mine called Brad, who came over, and we kind of worked through this problem together. You don't have to be an expert yourself. You can always reach out to others to help you when you get stuck. And so with this, on a read-only kernel, you can make it read, write, patch, and read-only. And this works for all Android kernels that, well, I think it works for all Android kernels, with the exception of Samsung, that protects those permissions using a hypervisor, using its NOx. But just remember this. All I'm doing is changing a flag in the kernel. The kernel is on your boot image. And if you've bootloader unlocked, what stops some other piece of malware going in and flipping that bit there and turning read, write, execute back on, or adding code to your kernel? These are the risks that you take when you bootloader unlock your phone. So now we're back at the problem where we actually want to hook. We want to intercept messages. And the problem is I'm still getting crashes because where this function is, the QC-SCM call, is actually located too far away from my driver and address space. So I actually need to do an absolute call in order to be able to reach it. But backwards compatibility is your friend, because that is SCM ARM v8 call. That's just checking whether you've got a 32-bit or 64-bit phone, which means that one of those code paths is never used on your device. And we can use this to our advantage when we want to hook. So we're going to take the disassembly of that function that we found. We found the call to get architecture to check whether it's a 32-bit or a 64-bit phone. It's then going to split whether it is a 32-bit or 64-bit phone. It's going to call the actual function that will send the message and the data across to Secure World and Trust Zone, which leaves these bytes here completely unused. And because we've got this ability to change the kernel to read, write, X, we can use them. So we're going to set up a very small call stub. Inside that, we're going to have the absolute address of our function where we're going to intercept all calls to. We're going to load it into a register and call that address. And then we're going to branch back to the original function. And at this point, we've set up a hook stub, a way to basically go from a relative address call to an absolute address call to redirect flow of execution to anywhere in the kernel. And in this case, we're redirecting it to our driver so we can see what's going on. And then to turn it on, we just patch that call to jump into our stub. And we have now seen every single request for Trust Zone, for Secure World, for trustlets, for loading, for unloading of trustlets. All of that stuff, we can now see our function will always get called first. And with that capability, you can do all sorts of kind of creative stuff. You could build your own firewall for trustlets. So you could say, I don't want to load Widevine. So when I see loads for Widevine DRM, I'm just going to drop them. You can then see malicious activity. You can use it for protocol analysis to kind of understand how you talk to trustlets in order to create better fuzzing rigs. And so with the ability to intercept, I thought, how great would it be if I could treat a trustlet like a Linux driver? And to do this, I need to be able to get access to some extra information. The trust zone does not tell you what's loaded. It does not tell you what trustlets have been loaded. But the QCCOM driver, it keeps a list. So let's find that list in the driver, which again, is private. We can't see it. But some function has to use it that's public. And it turns out QCCOM probe does a lot of initialization. And so we can mine that function for the address of that structure that contains the list of all the things that are loaded. And so we've got our probe function. And one of the first things it does is it loads up the page address for where that structure is. And then it adds to that address the offset in that page. And it does, ARM64 does this with 2 instructions. And this is a problem because you can't guarantee the compiler is going to put them next to each other. There could be all sorts of stuff in between. But we can do this easier. We don't have to find that add, that offset. If we know some magic values in that structure, we can search for those in the page. And it's very similar to the way that in the Android Bluetooth case, I looked for the magic value of 320 in the disassembly. So we're going to look for the 2 version numbers in that structure located next to each other, because I can know ahead of time what the version is. And when I find that spot, I also know the shape of the structure because I've got the Linux source code. And I can subtract its offset to get the address of that structure in memory. And this is really cool at this point because that structure has all the state for everything happening between Android and Secure World. And so from this, we can now set up our own calls to unload a trustlet. We can also load a trustlet in memory. And the way that trustlets get loaded into Secure World is using this thing called Ion. And Ion is a Linux driver that's responsible for allocating large chunks of memory. And it can allocate those chunks of memory physically one after the other in physical memory. And this is important because the only thing that's common between normal world and secure world is physical addresses. And so with the Ion handle that we can get because we've got that structure, we can allocate memory that will work perfectly for trust zone. And then we can put our own trustlet image in memory into that buffer and send the physical address to trust zone. And if it loads, we get back an identifier, a 32-bit identifier. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of show you this driver that I wrote to do this, which I call Danger Zone. So I'm going to just quickly cut over to where are we? No. Oh, wow, this is going to be fun. All right. So I've just plugged my phone in. And I can connect to my phone using ADB. And I can go to root, where I've got permissions to see, load, and unload Linux drivers. So there's my JoyCon drivers as they're loaded in memory. But now we want to actually load our Danger Zone driver. I knew someone was going to say that. Let's see if I can do this. Look at this. He's using the big screen. Like, this is great. Okay, here we go. Is that a bit better? I'll leave it like this because in a second you'll see why. Okay, cool. So, Danger Zone. Oh, trust me not to spell stuff properly in a live demo, you know. Cool. There we are. So the driver's loaded. So at the moment, we are now intercepting Qualcomm calls. So what can I demo for you today? Well, it turns out that if I just bring up my proc K message, I can see a log in my device. And my function hook at the moment just basically logs system calls. So if I turn off my phone, and then I try and run my finger over the fingerprint scanner, you'll see a whole bunch of messages swarming by as it tries to talk to the fingerprint trustlet in Secure World on my phone. And I can see the application in Android and its process ID, and I can see the trustlet that it's talking to. And I can see all the messages that they're sending between them. Now, this might obviously not work if it's encrypted, because then those might be encrypted buffers. But you can see it, which means you can dissect it. So you can analyze it, and then you can reverse engineer it, and fuzz it, and potentially exploit it. But you might also want, as part of this, the ability to load trustlets. So first, my driver, which comes up under dev DZ, you can see the list of loaded trustlets. And we can actually load them as well. And so for this, I'm going to use Silvio as an example, because as it turns out, you can load trustlets under whatever name you like. So I'm going to send Silvio to the danger zone. So all your trustlets, or at least a lot of them, are located under vendor firmware. Widevine is like Google's DRM encryption trustlet. And there we are. We've just loaded a trustlet. That easy, just like a driver. And you can load any trustlet. But what's interesting is that if I tried to load Widevine under a different name now, it would fail. So TrustZone is keeping some kind of list of trustlets that are loaded. And because I've loaded this one as Silvio, applications on my phone that now want Widevine can't actually load it. So I've actually DOSed my phone from being able to do DRM at the moment. So maybe what we can do is we can unload Silvio. We'll get Silvio out of the danger zone. And there we are. It's back to the way it was. And if we look at proc K message, you can see the one above there, which is QCCOM app shutdown command. So we can even see our loads and unload because we're hooked so high up in the kernel. OK. And so with that, that kind of concludes my talk. And all my code is available on my GitLab page, including the danger zone driver. That's my Twitter handle. But if you want to contact me, I would recommend emailing me if you have questions, because I'm not a very competent Twitter user yet. But yes, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. I can't actually see anyone. Yeah, and Silver's coming up to give me a hand.
Do we have mic runners just up the front?
It's all right, I'll shout it out.
OK. I'll repeat the question.
Are the trustlets signed? Can you load any arbitrary code, or does the trustlet need signing before you load and execute?
OK. So the question is, do trustlets need signing before they'll be allowed to be loaded by the trust zone? And my understanding is that yes, the trust zone itself checks the signatures of trustlets before they're loaded. However, I think depending on the implementation and the version and the age of your phone, whether it actually has a whitelist and a blacklist of bad trustlets that have been proven to be vulnerable can vary. So depending on your device, you might have a signed trustlet with a vulnerability that can actually still be loaded. So yes, they do need to be signed in order to be loaded. Although maybe this might help people fuzz that and actually see if there's any issues in that area.
Any more questions? Up there?
So I'm just wondering, can this technique be used to extract device encryption keys that are used for like full device encryption, etc.
Okay. Can this be used to extract device encryption keys? So for those who aren't aware, device encryption keys are very, very special values that are kept secure and locked down inside the secure world. They're the things that back all your encryption, including your full disk encryption on your Android devices, for example. In theory, they should not be made available to anywhere outside their trustlet, let alone anywhere in the normal world, in the Linux kernel. But phones are built by a wide variety of manufacturers, and I would not be surprised if someone conducting research in this space actually found some terrible phone that leaked a device key. So the answer is no, it shouldn't be possible, but people in general, including myself, are terrible programmers.
Any more questions? So let's thank Pete for a great talk.
Thank you.